That we are in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. On behalf of the store, and with thanks to Carnation Books, it is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for the launch of A Land So Wild by Elyssa Warkentin. Here to introduce Elyssa and conduct a conversation with her, please join me in welcoming her editor, Elyssa Mitchell.
Thank you, Kaylin. Thank you for coming, everybody. I'm so happy tonight to be able to introduce Elyssa Warkentin and her exciting book, A Land So Wild. Elyssa Warkentin did her PhD in Gender Studies and Victorian Literature at the University of Alberta, after which she took teaching contracts in Turkey and Qatar. She now works at the University of Manitoba as a research facilitator. Her most recent academic publications include edited works of Marie Belloc-Lowndes, and this is her first published novel. This is really exciting because writing is an integral part of our friendship. Our shared interest in online fandom and our mutual suspicion of Dickens, which I know makes us terrible Victorianists, led to real-life collaborations, both academic and creative. We've given panels and presented papers on adaptations of fan fiction and fanfic adaptations of Victorian novels. And we've proofread each other's work. We also began to do Victorian-themed writing challenges, and it's there that this novel was born. The book that you see today, it was my privilege to watch Elyssa pull together the threads of Arctic exploration, colonialism, and women's suffrage. After much more hard work on her part, we now have A Land So Wild, which is both literally and figuratively an ambitious exploration. On the surface, it's an adventure story. A rich and influential merchant, Sir Francis Hall, equips the ship to rescue Captain William Calderson's lost Arctic expedition, and not coincidentally discover the Northwest Passage. David Maxwell, who himself served under Calderson, has his own reasons for wanting to find the expedition. Maxwell is determined not just to find the expedition, but to lay the ghosts of his own past to rest. The journey he intends, as is so often the case, is not the journey he experiences, however. Not least because Sir Francis Hall has added his own son, a very wayward one, a naturalist, to the crew roster. Lost to cocaine in the seedy underbelly of London, the last thing Embleton Hall wants is a voyage to the Arctic. But he discovers that sometimes the last thing that you want can be the thing that you need. The narrative of Arctic exploration, told realistically through letters and counterbalanced by voices that are infrequently heard in this type of literature. In England, the women left behind must contend with the restrictions and realities of a patriarchal society. In Nunavut, the Inuit must contend with the thoughtless and violent acts of colonial oppression. A Land So Wild allows the women of England and the Inuit of Kikitac to speak their truths and their lives. The exploration and discovery thus turns the colonial narrative back on itself and requires the men of the Serapis to question their country, their values, and themselves. Please welcome Elyssa Warkentin.
Thanks, Elyssa. And thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really thrilled to be celebrating the launch of my very first novel with all of you. I always wanted to be a fiction writer since I was a little girl, but I didn't think that I was that kind of writer. I'm an academic and I write essays. That's the kind of writer that I was. And so after my childhood, I never attempted long-form fiction again, and I was really sad about that. I was sad that I could never be that kind of writer. But somehow I just kind of assumed that's the way it was. And then about 6 years ago, I realized that the reason I wasn't a fiction writer was because I wasn't writing fiction. And I could change that by starting to write fiction. And so I set out to consciously learn how to do it, to work on that craft. And I started with very short stories. My first one was exactly 221 words, and it took me about 10 days to write 221 words. But gradually the stories got longer and I got faster and better, and the writing got easier and it felt more natural, and my projects got longer and more sophisticated as well. And since then I've written a young adult novel, which is unpublished, and several novel-length fan fictions with Elyssa in various Victorian-themed writing challenges. And then eventually I wrote The Land So Wild, which took about a year from conception to the complete first draft. But I didn't do any of this alone. As Elyssa has alluded, in my wanderings through online fandoms, I discovered fan fiction, and with it, a community of brilliant and dedicated and generous women writers. They're academics, they're professional writers, they're amateur writers, and they were genuinely and actively engaged in supporting and amplifying each other's voices, and improving their craft and taking pleasure in their craft. And that's how I met my first audiences, and that's where I met my writing partners and my publisher and my editors, and all of these are professional women. And so that was my crash course in creative writing, and that was my training, and those writers are my mentors and my instructors. And so that's how this novel came to be. It was birthed by that community, and I was birthed by that community as a writer. And Elyssa, who was my very first editor and one of my writing partners, she was a big part of that, and so I'm really thrilled that she could be here today. So I wrote A Land So Wild for a lot of reasons, and probably the first was that I love Arctic survival literature. When I was a kid, I read novels like Julie of the Wolves and Hatchet, and I was really into that genre. And I also love Victorian literature, and I love epistolary stories. And so I wanted to try my hand at combining those things. Just because it was so much fun to think about and to plan. I had a ball planning this novel. And honestly, that's probably my most enduring lesson from fan fiction, is to write because you love something. And so I ended up with this, and it's sort of a mystery, sort of an adventure, sort of a love story, and it's about the way that humans use stories to make sense of themselves. And I especially wanted to think about the relation of story to truth, and the effects of silence, of stories not told. So what about the women, our brave Arctic explorers left at home? What about the indigenous people the explorers encounter? What about men who love men? How did they articulate their experiences to themselves and to each other? And how did they navigate competing or conflicting narratives? So I wanted to think about how untold stories can provide both freedom and constraint in how we imagine the possibilities of our lives. So I'm going to read two sections for you today from fairly early in the novel. I didn't want to give any spoilers, so these are all from pretty early on. So the first section that I'm going to read is a series of log entries from a variety of perspectives from our explorers in the north. So we'll have a bit of ship's log, which is the official goings-on aboard the ship, the Captain Maxwell's personal log, naturalist Embleton Hall's personal log, and a little bit of Inuit oral history as well. And then the second part that I will read is an exchange of letters amongst the women friends back home in England. So we have Mrs. Addie Maxwell, who is Captain David Maxwell's wife. We have her young friend, Hannah Crawley, who is the first mate's fiancée. And then we have their friend in the Women's Suffrage Committee, Abaya Higginbottom. All right, so the first section. Ship's log, 21st July, 1850. Disaster has again befallen us. At 6:30, a squall from the south-southwest suddenly took the ship, which carried away her fore and main topmasts and topgaunt masts, together with the jib boom, a direful casualty under the circumstances of our position. All hands were called to shorten sail and clear the wreck. Luckily for us, the squall was of short duration, and the wind, subsequently, for a short time, fell light. The spars with the rigging attached were hanging over the ship's side, and 4 of our men, in their activity and zeal, had got out the jib boom before this was carried away, which it was subsequently, to the top masts, and with it was precipitated into the water, the ship pitching heavily at the time. All the crew were in immediate activity to save their messmates, our smallest boat manned in less time than it takes to right it. They were found clinging tenaciously to the rigging attached to the spars, and were soon picked up under the bows, having fortunately sustained no injury, only the discomfort of their temporary submersion. Several whales had appeared about the ship and were still close to us, spouting with a loud blowing noise their graceful curves of water into the air. We became somewhat anxious for the safety of the little boat, as one of those huge monsters rising under her keel or a stroke of its powerful tail would inevitably have capsized her. She regained us, however, in safety. During the remainder of the day, all was bustle and activity in repairing the damage. Nothing could exceed the zeal with which our men work, and Taylor first among them. Taylor is the first mate. Ship's log, 4th August, 1850. Repairs at last complete, and we begin to make good ground in what has been a difficult crossing. We knew the northern route would pose challenges. It certainly has done so. In the course of the day, we exchanged colors with 2 American whalers, which were apparently full and homeward bound. Several whales were also seen spouting at a distance, and the carcass of one floated past us, with myriads of seabirds regaling themselves upon its flesh. Naturalist's log, 4th August, 1850. Extraordinary stroke of luck! Sailed through a pod of whales around noon, and minutes later a young carcass floated past. In short order, I was rowing the dinghy out to examine it. Imagine the state of it. Entirely uncontaminated by man and touched only by natural processes. With my hinged saw and chisel to engorge it, I was able to enact a speedy post-mortem and discovered numerous ulcers of the stomach and a severe parasitical infestation. List of stomach contents appended. Samples taken from organs and tissues, and liquids acquired when possible. Well satisfied with the day's work, I shall be several days at least in making my analyses. A most welcome respite from the monotony. Captain's log, 4th August, 1850. Good Christ in heaven, give me strength to deal with Embleton Hall. Today we observe firsthand the ample number of giant whales frequenting this sea, which enables us, incidentally, to testify to its excellence as a cruising ground for whalers. Early afternoon, we sailed by the putrid, bloated carcass of a specimen which had died days ago. The smell wafted over the deck and disturbed the entire watch. Hall, the so-called naturalist, an actual madman, was instantly into the dinghy and over the side, and was soon shoulder deep in rotting whale flesh, looking happier than I have ever seen him. It took 3 strong men to finally drag him, half drowned and fully frozen, back to the ship. I've forbidden him from going below deck until he thoroughly bathes himself. His clothing, I dare say, we will drag behind the ship for a time. The man is nothing but pleased with himself. The crew now alternates between horror, annoyance, and incredulity. I confess I do not know what to make of him. He alternates between pathological lethargy of spirit and wild enthusiasms that are strange in the extreme. He is entirely self-contained and speaks but little to his shipmates, but occasionally he can be drawn out to talk a little about his latest finds and observations. He then becomes so obviously enraptured, one finds it difficult not to be carried along with him. Told by Kumaglak of Salek when the sky dwellers appear. The ends of the land and sea are bounded by an immense abyss, over which a narrow and dangerous pathway leads to the heavenly regions. The sky is a great dome of hard material arched over the earth. There is a hole in it through which the spirits pass to the true heavens. Only the spirits of those who have died a voluntary or violent death and the raven have been over this pathway. The spirits who live there light torches to guide the feet of new arrivals. They can be seen there feasting and playing and dancing together. The whistling, crackling noise which sometimes accompanies the light of the sky dwellers is the voices of these spirits trying to communicate with the people of the earth. They should always be answered in a whisper. The spirits are called Salamiot. Ship's log, 26th August, 1850. The aurora borealis was faintly seen for the first time tonight, but was much obscured by the dense haze which prevails. It extends fully from northeast to southwest. The force of a current setting north 14 degrees west from 20 to 25 miles a day antagonizes the power of the wind. Captain's log, 27 August, 1850. We are now daily employed in putting in order and preparing all necessary implements for ice navigation. Ice anchors and chisels, hatchets, saw, whale lines, etc. This is an occupation novel to many, including myself. Under Taylor's careful instruction, all have been duly overhauled and got on deck in readiness for use. The crow's nest has been hoisted to its aerial position at the foretop gallant masthead. Taylor has rigged it up with a trapdoor at the bottom sufficiently large to admit one person, but hooded over at the top with canvas so as to afford protection from the wind to its occupant, who is generally the ice master. From here, observation can be made of the ice in relative comfort. Every day we creep closer to our quarry, closer to him, and every day I grow more anxious. Hall must see it, for he watches me closely. I've seen him doing it, sitting over a book in the mess and pretending to read. Then too, when I am on deck going about my duties, I feel his eyes upon me. What does he see, I wonder? We walk the deck every night now, annoying the night watch to no end, I'm sure. The damned dreams give me no peace. Does he see my weakness? Worse still, does he see the cause? He's an interesting man, brilliant, I should say. I understand now how he fell into the abuse of cocaine, for his mind is relentless, spinning ever quicker and careless of the pain it causes the flesh that houses it. Sometimes my body falls behind my mind, he explained once, haltingly. The cocaine helped me to bear it. He did not wish to discuss the matter further. He must surely be one of the foremost natural scientists our country has produced, for his mastery of his subject appears absolute. At the same time, he has almost no knowledge of or interest in anything outside of it. The Calderson expedition was unknown to him, beyond some vague notion of Arctic exploration. I have related to him all the information I have, the probable route of the vanguard, the fraught history of the search for the Northwest Passage, the urgency of the mission, the heroism of Calderson himself. He asks no questions, but then he rarely speaks. Sometimes, more often than not lately, I wake hoarse and trembling from my dreams to Hall's soft rap on my cabin door. We go up on deck and walk together then. Sometimes we walk in silence, but more often now he will speak to me of what he is reading, Larson's latest theory of this or the migratory habits of that. He speaks softly and gravely as if imparting an important lesson to a recalcitrant child. It seems unlikely that my comfort is Hall's concern, for he is careless of everyone and everything except for his work, for all that anyone can tell. And yet it helps. It does help to feel one has a friend. Naturalist log, 28 August 1850. The number of birds appears daily on the increase, driftwood also in greater abundance. The sea appears full of life. I had the dredge overboard and added to my collection numerous specimens of the crustaceous animals. Today we saw 2 white whales and a narwhal going to the westward. I should not trust Captain Maxwell. I should shun anyone associated with my father on general principle, and yet I have made a close study of him, and I cannot bring myself to believe that he would willfully harm me. At any rate, he's not thrown me overboard yet, so I suppose I owe him a debt of gratitude. Surely in his absence, the crew would have divested itself of my presence long ago. Ship's log, 30th August 1850. During the night, the breeze freshened almost to the force of a gale, and the direction of the wind was not favorable for us, but by morning it entirely subsided with every indication of fine weather to come. All anxiously looking out for the first appearance of land, the crow's nest is seldom without an occupant, and as daylight is persistent, there is now no period of true darkness to interrupt our view. Captain's log, 30th August 1850. The hour of midnight comes, but I cannot sleep. This is to me the most enjoyable period of the day. All work on board has eased. Everything is still and quiet, only the watch on deck. Now too the naturalist emerges from below deck to take the air. He shuns all company, except, I flatter myself, for mine. Now all are hushed to silence, save the low murmuring of the wind and the wash of waters from the ship's progress. It is as if we are all taking in a deep, clean breath and holding it together, poised, for we know not what. In the long twilight that has taken the place of night, the aspect of the heavens is truly beautiful. A wide belt of refracted light extending along the horizon resolves into its prismatic colors, imparting a degree of beauty I have never before witnessed. The gorgeous and brilliant, yet varied tints of coloring could not possibly be surpassed. The moon rises slowly in the same quarter. At such times, I feel fortunate to be here. Whatever the sorrows of our lives, we are here to witness this great beauty. I tried to impart as much to Hall. He made no reply. So that was the first section. The second section is an exchange of letters between some of the women characters. So this is Addie Maxwell, who is Captain Maxwell's wife. She is the secretary of the Women's Suffrage Committee. She's writing to her friend, Hannah Crawley, who is the fiancée of Lou Taylor, who is the first mate aboard the ship. And they also have some letters with a woman named Amaya Higginbottom, who is the president of the Women's Suffrage Committee. So I have a few letters from her. 19th September 1850, to Miss Hannah Crawley, 54 Oxford Street, London. Dear Miss Crawley, please forgive me for taking the liberty of writing to you without a formal introduction, but our situations are themselves unusual. I believe we have an acquaintance in common aboard the vessel Serapis. I am Captain Maxwell's wife and Lou Taylor's friend. I have lately received a letter from my husband, the last, in all likelihood, before his eventual return to London, and in it he passed along Mr. Taylor's hope that I would extend my hand to you in the spirit of friendship.
It is my joy to do so. I feel quite strongly that we women left behind are a sisterhood of necessity, Miss Crawley, but it is just as well to turn such a necessity into a pleasure. Won't you please come to tea? Come as soon as you like, tomorrow, the day after. I should so very much like to meet you. Most sincerely, Miss Addie Maxwell, 23 Little Eastcheap Street, London. Asualik tells the legend of Sedna at Kikatarjuak 2 moons after the great storm. Once there lived on a solitary shore an old man with his daughter Sedna. His wife had been dead for some time, and the two led a quiet life. Sedna grew to be a handsome girl, and the youths came from all around to sue for her hand, but she would not accept any of them. Finally, at the breaking up of the ice in the spring, a great fisherman came from the lands far distant and wooed Sedna by offering her father a great cache of dried fish. Her father could not resist and sent his daughter away over the sea with the strange fisherman. When at last they reached the home of the fisherman, after a long and hard journey, Sedna discovered that her husband had deceived her. When his foot touched land, he transformed into a fulmar. Her new home, was not built of beautiful pelts, as he had promised, but was covered with wretched fish skins full of holes that gave free entrance to the wind and snow. Instead of soft reindeer skins, her bed was made of hard walrus hides, and she had to live on the miserable fish which the other fulmars brought her. In her despair, she sang, "O Father, if you knew how wretched I am, you would come to me. Oh, come and take me back home." When a year had passed and the sea was again stirred by warmer winds, the father left his country to visit Sedna. His daughter greeted him joyfully and besought him to take her back home. The father, hearing of the outrages wrought upon his daughter, determined upon revenge. He killed the fulmar, took Sedna into his boat, and then quickly left the country which had brought so much sorrow to Sedna. When the other fulmars came home and found their companion dead and his wife gone, they all flew away in search of the fugitives. Their cries of rage and anguish can still be heard. Having flown a short distance, they discerned the boat, and with their wings they stirred up a heavy storm. The sea rose in immense waves that threatened the pair with destruction. In this mortal peril, the father offered Sedna to take to the birds, flinging her overboard. She clung to the edge of the boat. The father then took a knife and cut off her fingers. Falling into the sea, the fingers were transformed into whales. Sedna held onto the boat more tightly, but her hands fell under the sharp knife and swam away as seals. When the father cut off her forearms, they became walruses. At last, with a great blow to her head, Sedna fell away entirely and sank under the waves. She lives there forever, commanding the sea creatures that are born of her body. That is why the hunters sing songs to her, and why the liver of the first killed seal is always returned to the sea. 21st September 1850, to Mrs. Addie Maxwell, 23 Little Eastcheap Street, London. Dear Mrs. Maxwell, thank you so much for your kindness and hospitality yesterday. I did so enjoy myself at tea. As I mentioned, I lead an exceedingly retiring life and do not often go visiting, and so it is particularly delightful for me to have met such a charming new friend. Your work with the Women's Suffrage Committee is fascinating. It was a great pleasure to hear of it. Thank you, too, for the loan of the books. I read Mrs. Staunton's small pamphlet this morning and have now begun Miss Fuller's. I confess to some confusion when she writes, "There is no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman." I'm sure I'm very stupid, but this sounds to me like a misapprehension of the natural order of things. We do not have literature of this sort in our household. Please forgive me if my views are uninformed. For all that I've read every book in my father's library, and some several times over, I have never come across such radical and interesting ideas. I greatly look forward to discussing them with you further. Most sincerely, Hannah Crawley, 54 Oxford Street, London. October 1st, 1850. To Mrs. Addie Maxwell, 23 Little Eastcheap Street, London. Dear Addie, thank you for your kind invitation. I should like nothing more than to pass the afternoon in your charming company, but I cannot come to tea. Papa has had a terrible attack. The doctor says I must not leave the house until my arm is healed, in perhaps 2 or 3 weeks. Your affectionate, Hannah Crawley, 54 Oxford Street, London. 1st October 1850, to Hannah Crawley, 54 Oxford Street, by return post. Little Hannah, oh my dear girl, I'm so very sorry. Of course you must stay home. Listen to your doctor and heal well. I shall send my maid over directly with a parcel for you, an excellent salve for drawing out bruises, a poultice for your arm, and perhaps a book or 2 to divert you. I'll instruct it to be placed in your own maid's hand. We certainly do not wish to alarm your father. Have her watch for it at 7 o'clock. Your friend, Addie Maxwell. 21st October 1850. To Mrs. Addie Maxwell, 23 Little Eastcheap Street, London. Dear kind Addie, I write again to thank you, this time for your extreme solicitude during my convalescence. I enjoyed the books you sent tremendously, and I greatly appreciate your discussion in the matter. I'm pleased to report that Dr. Brown has pronounced me fit and well. My arm hurts me hardly at all anymore. I have been given permission to resume my usual activities. I wish nothing more than that I might invite you to call upon me here, but my father's health and temperament prescribe that possibility. Might I be so bold as to call on you tomorrow? I must return your books, and I would like to hear more about your thoughts on them and the work of your committee. Most sincerely, Hannah Crawley, 54 Oxford Street, London. 21st October 1850, to Hannah Crawley, by return post. Dear Hannah, of course you must come tomorrow. Come for luncheon, for tea, what you will. I shall be delighted to see you well, and I do most solemnly promise not to talk shop the entire time. As you are no doubt learning, once I begin to discourse on the movement of women, it is rather difficult to head me off. Most sincerely, Addie Maxwell, 23 Little East Cheap Street, London. 22nd October 1850. To Mrs. Addie Maxwell, Secretary, Women's Suffrage Committee, from Abaya Higginbottom, President, Women's Suffrage Committee. Dear Addie, possibly you have heard the news, but it is worth sharing again. Lord Howard has agreed to submit the petition to the House of Lords sometime in the new year. As per the resolution passed at the May Assembly, I shall draw up the final wording for approval by the Association's executive at the next meeting. I feel most strongly that the petition must call for the entire enfranchisement of our sex, regardless of birth, property, education, and so on, and must rest upon rational arguments rather than sentimentality. There is a portion of our membership who would have us press our so-called moral advantage and use the imagined purity and goodness of our sex as the sole argument for suffrage, but that is not equality either. What we want for women is equal rights, equal admission to all social privileges, not a position apart, a sort of sentimental priesthood. Casting ourselves as the moral guardians of the nation will do us no good in the future and only serves to divide our movement now. The only question of any import is whether it is right and expedient that one half of the human race should pass through life in a state of forced subordination to the other half. Any other question is a distraction from our ultimate goal. I trust you are yourself in agreement. Anything you can do to sway our more, shall we say, angelic sisters at arms to our own understanding in advance of the coming meeting would be most helpful. It would also be beneficial to recruit as many new sisters as possible. Our voice, when it speaks, must be unequivocal. And now I must beg forgiveness for the business-like tone of my letter, for I am equally desirous to know, how are you, dear? What news from your wandering husband? What are you reading, and what do you think of the new Dickens? Is it not appallingly dull? I must come to London soon. I am most desirous to see the new construction in Hyde Park. Can the so-called Crystal Palace possibly be as ostentatiously allegorical as it sounds? Yours, Abaya Higginbottom. 26th October 1850, to Abaya Higginbottom, President, Women's Suffrage Committee, from Addie Maxwell, Secretary, Women's Suffrage Committee. Dear Abaya, delightful news both from Lord Howard and from you. I shall look forward to your visit with eager anticipation. Please do stay with me. The house has been too quiet since David's been away, and I would love to have you all to myself. As to the business of your letter, I do of course agree with you entirely. As you know, I can be quite persuasive when I wish to be, and I have now turned all my efforts to the more problematic members of our little association. How they cannot see the dangers and flaws inherent in their arguments is beyond me, but I have my own stratagems, and I make headway. I do not rage, Abaya. Oh no, you would be quite proud of me. Instead, I smile and I charm. Innocently, I ask why the existence of one half of the species should be merely ancillary to that of the other, and why each woman should be a mere appendage to a man, allowed to have no interests of her own, and that there may be nothing to compete within her mind, with his interests and his pleasures. And then I say, with wide-eyed wonder, the only reason which can be given is that men like it. It is agreeable to men that they should live for their own sake, and women for the sake of men. It is agreeable to them that we learn to think it so natural that we do not question it. It is agreeable to them that we accept some abstract notion of moral superiority as long as we cede all actual power to them. And if this is so, how can our moral superiority, unquestioned, you understand, how can it have any persuasive weight with such self-interested creatures? And they look startled, Abaya. Some of them physically flinch, and I do feel for the matron who must return home to cook her husband's dinner after learning to see him as her captor for the first time. The thing we must remember is we are united in a common goal, and women, regardless of the vagaries of their arguments, can never be our enemies, not even those who oppose our methods most stridently. And now that is enough politics for today. David Copperfield is dreadful. I refuse to read another word of it. On an entirely different note, perhaps you've heard of an interesting social establishment just off Covent Garden for men and women of certain libertine attitudes. Far be it for me to corrupt the sanctity of your hearth, Abaya, but I shall stand you a gin at Duke's, and will find a gentleman for the evening, yes? Or have you perhaps come to your senses and changed your mind again about other possibilities? Ah, you know I only tease. I sometimes miss the old days. Mrs. Addie Maxwell, Secretary, Women's Suffrage Committee, 23 Little East Cheap Street, London. And that's where I'll stop for now.